Thank you so much, Marisa. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Brenda Elsey to all of you. She is a professor of history at Hofstra University. Dr. Elsey is originally from Detroit and stayed home, at least in the state, for her undergraduate at Michigan State University. So she shares some school with Dr. Esplin here. She went on for her PhD at Stony Brook. I always get those State University of New York, Stony Brook. Is that the official title? She studies the history of sports, gender, popular culture, and politics in 20th century Latin America. She has authored and co-authored numerous books and articles, including Futbolera, a history of women in sports in Latin America, as well as Citizens and Sportsmen, Football and Politics in 20th Century Chile. She has also published in popular venues such as Sports Illustrated, The New Republic, The New York Times, and other publications. She is also working in conjunction with FIFA to try to combat prejudice, racism, homophobia, and other things in stadiums at FIFA-sanctioned events in Latin America. And so she travels to do that. And she probably doesn't have a whole lot of time for those stories, but she's got some interesting stories with regard to that. Dr. Elsey is a relatively recent cancer survivor. We're all very grateful about that. She is also the proud mother of 3 children. I probably shouldn't have put those 2 things right next to each other, but as a father of a few of those, sometimes they might feel like that. Anyway, but why don't you join me in giving a big hand to Dr. Elsey.
For having me. It has been a pleasure to be here the last couple days. I had a fancier shirt, and then Latin American Studies gifted me this gorgeous swag, and I just couldn't resist. I do thank these departments. It's really hard to bring people. It's a lot of time, hassle, financial impediments, and they all do it because they want to connect people and students with others, and I really appreciate the efforts that were made by all 3 of these programs, and these are what I did, right? This is the same thing. Latin American Studies, I co-direct Women's Studies, and I'm a historian. So all of these 3 things, these are the 3 of my favorite things. And so I really appreciate all of the effort that's gone into this. This is a picture, painting actually, that is in the National Museum in Mexico, which was done by a painter, Zaraga, who was in Spain, for a while, and then France, but is Mexican, and did this painting based upon women that he was seeing. It might have been his wife at the time. It's unclear who the model was, but there was a series of them, and they're from the very early 20th century, and a friend of mine kind of came across it and sent it, and they were just beautiful, and it's the beginning of the book, and it's one of the many ways in which the history of women's football in Latin America is really right under our noses in all kinds of places and just wasn't brought together, and it's still ongoing. My book is the first of many, I hope and know, that I co-authored with Josh Nadel. And I think a lot of times students ask me, and someone in the last class just asked me this question, which was really good, and it was probably someone right there, about, does sexism and discrimination reflect the society in football? Is it worse in football or soccer? Sorry, I'm going to use those interchangeably from now. I forget I'm in a football country like this way. And I think that the answer is that, of course, it reflects society, but it also is a place that we aspire and hope to be a platform that mirrors the way we want the world to be, right? So you are angry about athletes getting advantages like doping or violating those rules because you want sports to be a fair place. It's an aspiration. Oh, is this what I should do? Hear you better. Oh, you can hear me better. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. All right. Cool. All right. Once again, the shirt really coming in handy. How is this? Is this better? Oh, awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that. And so, one of the things is that sort of compels us, I think, to come back to sports and time again is because we've seen it as a place to build community, as a site for national identity making. It traditionally is where we think we see the ultimate or the best that the human body can do, whether it's the fastest you can run, the highest that you can jump, the strongest that you can be. So for a lot of reasons, I was interested in sports. Not because I played soccer or was any good at it, I still am not, but because in doing the history of Latin America, I realized right away, and many of you with experience in the region probably know, it is the most popular civic association throughout the region. It is the most popular cultural practice. And that means it's a really important place for defining what masculinity looks like there, what femininity looks like there, what local politics are like, what national identity is going to look like. It's a place, I remember Roberto da Mata, who was a really famous anthropologist from Brazil, said, I'm paraphrasing and he would say it much nicer, but imagine it's Brazilian and I look more distinguished and it's in great Portuguese. He would say something like, some parts of the world, nations are famous for their weapons and their wars. And in Brazil, we have a futebol, and I'm good with that. And so certainly, it's been recognized as that type of place. Okay, so wait, how do I forward it? The slides? Do you know? Anyone? And can we just do the... Maybe there's like a...
Oh, there you go.
Maybe that... I don't know if that was me or them. Thank you if that's you. I don't know. I just kind of kept pressing. Okay. All right. That's great. So the first place we kind of look at with gender in Latin America were the growth of physical education programs, which became compulsory in the 19th century as the new nations in Latin America were establishing themselves. The idea is that physical education, in the case of men, would build the best army, the best workers. In the case of women, would contribute to maternal health and well-being. And so with this liberal idea, which has its problems, including things like making sure that education was compulsory so people would stop speaking indigenous languages, be sure that they adopted the habits and trappings of European civilization, also came opportunities for girls to participate in physical education. And it's not that dissimilar from US history as well. And so that's the first place. So the very first soccer clubs that we find women playing in are groups of alumni of schools, teachers of schools that get together and form these football soccer clubs at the same time that Latin American men are, and that is around the 1870s and 1880s. And historians sometimes can get really lost in weeds. So I'm just quickly going to come up to the present. One of the reasons that it was really important for us to go and try to find this history is because Marissa, media major, right? Because journalists again and again allowed justifications for neglecting women's sport to be made on the fiction that it was new. That they kept saying, you just need to be patient. Women's soccer just started. You just got a team together for the first time. So what do you expect? You're not going to get a lot of resources. So as historians, we have found that history often confers legitimacy on groups and subjects, right? No, they were here since the beginning. Women were forming clubs since the beginning. And though that shouldn't necessarily matter, they should just deserve equal treatment. It is another argument that they have, which, no, this is a long tradition. The first people playing sports, because they're not any different than any other Latin American that loves soccer, was from the beginning. So we went to the archives, and it's a very lonely job. You just you kind of look through papers and articles and magazines and all of this type of stuff. And the first example that we have is from Chile Now, that could be because I'm originally a Chileanist, I lived in Chile, and I was looking for years. I would bet that if one of you wants to go and do a dissertation, please do, on this type of work, wherever you end up, you could find an older example. This is dated at 1900. It's probably with the typography, in my opinion, 1910. And so that's this one. And you can see we have Spanish speakers, right, that abound. We just heard Spanish. Can anybody want to summarize what this, can you read it well enough to summarize this top caption? It says, it never would have occurred to us that there would exist in Chile a women's football club made up of the weaker and beautiful sex. If this photograph doesn't lie, here we have this team formed by, pretty attractive women. That's what it says, not me. And it also shows that they are about to rob men of everything that belongs to them. So, todos sus campos. So it's not like they were secretly, it's not like, the men who were trying to stop women from playing football were secret about this. They were like, no, women playing football is going to rob us of everything. And what did it rob them of? It did rob them of a monopoly over public space that they had, spaces in parks, and the time of women in domestic labor. So the idea was for women and girls to be doing this, the time that they would be doing this is time spent away from the family. And that was seen as robbing men of their right to control women's labor. And they're saying it, in this case, I don't need to put words in their mouth. So that was sort of up there. And here we have from Argentina, this is the oldest kind of regulation type of evidence that we have of an Argentine team with a referee, with a coach, with captains, and so from about, that's a little bit later, 1916, 1917, we see this. And then there begins to be leagues, whole leagues, Chile, Brazil, Argentina, and that makes sense because those are the first leagues that you have in South American football. So the men's championship is 1916 to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Argentine independence. Okay. Well, we'll get through this fairly quickly. The old stuff, I promise. I won't talk too long. This was found in a local archive in Coquimbo, Chile. Has anyone been to Chile? I know a few of you have. Yeah, Coquimbo, popular place. Kind of small, hard to get to. I took a bus. I didn't stop because I didn't like any of the places it was taking me. Eventually, I got to a public library. There was this donation made, and this donation was made, and this is a group of laundry workers, and the point of showing you this is to show you that it wasn't just an elite women's activity, that soccer from the very beginning was something, just like with men, that was a cross-class place for socialization, which is one of the reasons I think that it's really an interesting and in many ways promoted democracy in Chile in that moment. These clubs were able to really pull together people from different political parties, people from different socioeconomic classes and geography, and they had rules of governance, and they were very elaborate. And the same is likely true of women too, labor unions. So this is laundry workers, and this is the caption that was written by the archivist. And so the donation was made around the 1950s or 60s, but the photo is from the 1930s. And it says, the first women's football team that existed in Coquimbo, it was called Aurora Porteña, and it was formed by the women working in the laundromat of this family, which is presumably the men over there. And it says here, the women today, the players today, or the women players today, are today respectable wives, many of them. Including these wives. So we have the women that are wives. Now, how do you read that? I mean, you read that as like, wait, don't worry, they're not lesbians. And that was very much a worry at the time, was that they developed proper sexuality, that they wanted to get married, that they wanted to have a family. And if football and soccer was supposed to create the ideal man, the worry, and this is in medical journals and educational journals and sports magazines, the worry was that women were somehow flawed or different, or there must be something wrong with them if they liked what was the most masculine of sports. Now here in the US, soccer isn't really defined in that same way because we already have the big three that serve a different purpose in terms of gender. But in South America, you know, to be a soccer player was kind of the ultimate way to form proper masculinity. And so the worry constantly is that these women might somehow be strange, either they go into it strange or rooting for each other has some kind of perverse ideal. And that leads to some very draconian policies that happened throughout the 20th century. So like there's debates throughout Latin America, including Costa Rica, El Salvador, Colombia, about prohibiting women's football. So the idea is it's becoming too popular. Once there were leagues in Brazil that formed in the late 1930s, the government of Getulio Vargas, with some really shoddy medical advice, suggests that they ban it. And they don't just ban regulation play. They ban football, period. Like in your backyard, at birthday parties for girls and women. And there's a lot of court cases that we looked at where they would prosecute women coaches. They said that they were probably sex trafficked. All types of accusations at the women that were involved in this. There's zero evidence that football was a sex trafficking organization in 1930s Brazil. But it was a constant harassment of these women that went all the way through 1981. But the women didn't listen. So we also have a lot of communication between the governors of different states of Brazil and the administration, the federal administration in Rio and then Brasilia, that are sending kind of notes to the governors and saying, we've heard there's women football that is being practiced in your state, and we need you to take a sharper hand. This is a violation of the policy of the administration. It wasn't just football, it was also water polo, I think the decathlon, wrestling, and perhaps boxing. But the only sport where women were actually in leagues and playing a lot was this one. And the reasoning of the Vargas regime was that they found a doctor. No one knows who this doctor is. He signs the letters like Futbolera. And you can look, I mean, this book, if you're interested, he basically says if a woman is hit in the abdomen area with a ball, it will impede her ability to have children and she will have an aneurysm. Now, you would just think in your daily life that some of the girls and women in your life maybe have been hit with balls and managed to come out of it on the other end. So you would think just like at the very base, but what we were interested in was showing how medical knowledge was actually used even when they knew it was wrong. And it had such a prestigious place among, and it still does, among exercise science and among sports, that there was no arguing with it, right? It was gonna hurt women's ability to have kids. The second argument of the medical community was that women could not withstand that kind of pain. Now, we are in a community that values family and maternal health, and I bet you know that there's quite a lot of pain involved in that process. And so, you know, maybe not for everyone, but I, as Dr. Shumway said, have 3 children, and I found it much more painful than any of the soccer matches I have ever played in. If you said to me, would you like to have this child through playing a pickup game or through labor, I can tell you how I would answer. And maybe some of you warriors would be different, you know, all the medals. But again, you would think they would just in their daily life, but they actually wrote this in medical journals through the 1960s. So we were very interested in the manipulation and the mobilization of the medical community at the service of what was just abject sexism. And then you can see that, it's hard to see, I'm sorry, it's fuzzy, but this is from 1958. And this is from Minas Gerais. And for whatever reason, if anyone is studying Brazil or interested in Brazil, we had a Brazilian reader for this. We've asked all the Brazilian historians that we know. We don't know why, but Minas Gerais is the place for women's football where they just disobeyed the order again and again and again. And it's very multiracial. It's very multi-class. And that may be, in fact, why the government of Brazil was so sort of upset about it. We don't know why, but for whatever reason, we have lots of photographic evidence from Minas Gerais in the 1950s, 60s, with these women players. There's a lot in Bahia, and if you know the Brazilian women's team today, you'll be like, oh, wow, yeah, they're still doing that. There's still a lot of them from there. And then we had, again, some players that get featured in local newspapers and things like that. This is a group of Chilean women, and the point of this is just to show a lot of the women and their history. We tried to do a women's social history. There's not a ton on it, to show the pleasure that they got from being able to travel for sports and play together. This is like a really big trip with a basketball team from Cabrera Ghana and the soccer team. And they go to Argentina, and it's really exciting for them. And again, this is a place where a lot of people travel internationally, and it's probably a real, like, important touchstone of one's life, right? And it was for them too. And sports offered this really important vehicle for them to do that. So in all of the memoirs and things, when we're talking about, like, why should women and girls be able to play, it's very poignant when you read. And there's snippets, there's not a ton, it's not like I have a huge memoir of anyone, but when you read, like, the thing that gave me the most confidence to learn to drive, in this case they had a male chaperone, was that I drove around Argentina when I was with my soccer team, you know, doing X, Y, and Z. And women traveling in this period, unmarried women, was very rare. So they were very important experiences for these women. Women's basketball also helps with football, as strange as that sounds. A lot of times the clubs that were pushing women's basketball, a lot of the players, because they are traditionally different seasons, would work to try to get the soccer, the rama de football in their club too, to kind of take off. This is Perón, maybe you know him, Juan Perón in Argentina, kind of big figure. A lot of the governments were very approving of basketball in a way that they weren't of soccer. Of course, they are of things like tennis and golf, but team sports, those are the most threatening to the idea of Latin American patriarchy, that there would be a team of women supporting, traveling together, etc. Okay, so this goes on, and I want to get to the present and talk with you and be more informal, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time going through every decade. But another major thing in our book, an event that tells you a lot of what you might want to know about Latin American women's football, is the second unofficial Women's World Cup in Mexico. The first one had been held in Italy in 1970, and it was sponsored by Martini e Rossi. Is it like booze or martinis or I don't know, something like that. I think the martini really is a martini, but it's like a liquor company in Italy. And that was the first one. And because FIFA had not condoned women's football, so FIFA said to all the federations, all the confederations in the 1960s, we're not ready for women's football, but when it happens, it has to be through us. So any federation that organizes a tournament will be punished, but no federation can organize a tournament. But if you do, it would have to be through us, but you can't. So Italy and the Italian women, because the Italian and French women like create their own Olympics in the 1930s, and they've got some real organizations that had gone on, put on a very good tournament in Italy. And because the 1968 Olympics had been in Mexico, 1970 World Cup is maybe arguably the most exciting World Cup in history, had been in Mexico. The idea was great. They've got the facilities, they've got the audience, let's take it to Mexico. And they did. And they sell out Estadio Azteca. So I apologize for whatever was recently supposedly the most popular women's sports event in college, which was the volleyball game. Because how many thousands of people was like? Nebraska. And, you know, that's wrong. Because before you altered Estadio Azteca, it's 110. So this is the largest women's sporting event, is the final of 1971. But still, that's awesome. And like, yay, Nebraska. Woo! You know what I mean? Volleyball's awesome. So it's not anything, but it sells out Estadio Azteca. You can see it, their standing room. They sell it through places like Sanborn's, this like chain of middle-class restaurants in Mexico. It's a very family event. I should have worn my t-shirt for that too. There's too many t-shirts. There's like Xochitl, which is a very cute girl, is the mascot. And it's a very big event. Okay, funny enough, this picture, so I find this picture, and this is the Argentine national team, and they're known as the Pioneers, the very first ones in 1971. They're the oldest team that goes to the tournament. Most are mothers. So whereas the Mexican team were a lot of students, you can see her down there, their like average age is like 19. The Argentine national women's team average age was like 30. And they had these women here. And if you want to look at their Facebook page, they have it, it's called the Pioneras de Fútbol Argentina. They have a Facebook page, they have a little museum they're trying to do. They're like incredible. They come out all the time for the national team, which I just found was here at BYU in 2018, the Argentine women's team, visiting 2018 or 2019, before France. And anyway, there they are, they're the first ones. And the funny thing, I don't have a picture, the good picture that I want to show you in color, so it wouldn't make a big impact in print. But I kept looking at the pictures of the delegations from 71, and I couldn't find the Argentine women. And it's because they didn't have the money to go, so they went in 3 waves, and they didn't have a coach that showed up. He just didn't show up. He like got drunk the night before and said like, sorry, I'm not coming. And so they go and they borrow a Mexican coach, and they borrow Mexican jerseys. So we kept being confused, like what happened to them? And they are there, but they're in Mexican jerseys. So we had to go to Argentina. We interviewed all these women. We're like, is that you? And they're like, yes, that's me. And I'm like, why are you wearing a Mexican jersey? And they're like, because our jerseys didn't show up till the 3rd round of people. So we didn't have any jerseys. So it was like mystery solved, like talk about, like my brain was like, oh, thankfully. So it was huge, it was great. And why do I show you this? Because a lot of the ongoing arguments about women's sports is, well, there's just not a market, there's just not an audience, they can't support themselves economically, and all the evidence points to the contrary, right? There's 110,000 people, it was enormously successful in Mexico. FIFA immediately sends a note to fine the Mexican Federation for loaning them the fields. And so the Mexican Football Federation then cancels the professional league that was planned at that time. Today, Mexico does have the most successful women's professional league in Latin America, you know, outside of the NWSL. And so what we find is, even though we know sports takes an enormous resource base, right? It's about investment, whether it's your police security, whether it's, you know, paying $200 million from the state of New York to fund the Buffalo Bills Stadium. That's investment. That's investment you're making as taxpayers, that you make as college students in fees. You have great fees, no criticism here, just saying. You know, that we invest in a community in those events. So the idea that it's just the market, right? That's the only reason that women's football doesn't have support, is it doesn't have a market. And that market is a real fiction when it comes to sports in terms of tax write-offs, security, stadium building. Also in Latin America, almost every club you know has gone bankrupt at least once and still exists because who bails them out? Taxpayers. You do. Colo-Colo, not you because you're not in Chile, but if you were in Chile, you would have paid for Colo-Colo many, many, many times. If you're in Argentina, you paid for Boca to get out of debt many, many times. And they're not willing to do that for women. So the argument that it's always a market, and it's not to say there isn't, is sort of this fiction. After 71, there's more and more pressure on Brazilians in particular to legalize football. They were invited to the 71 World Cup. They did not go because it was still prohibited in Brazil legally. And so eventually, in 81, it gets overturned. And one of the reasons is because feminism in Brazil in this period of democratization really began to embrace more working class causes. See, a lot of the women that are soccer players, they may not feel like they're feminists or say that they're feminists, but what they're doing challenges sexism. And so feminists kind of finally got a clue about that in the 1980s, like, wait a minute, even if they're not members of our organization, what they're doing is still a feminist cause. And that was very helpful to overturning the law, which eventually happened. So you can see, like, there's the first National Women's Art Festival. They have a women's football match. And they overturn the rule. But even in 1983, it takes until, so 81, yes, you can play in your backyard, but no, you don't get to play regulation games. Even when they change it, they're very clear here. You have different times, different balls, and you can't change your shirts. Like, and there's other rules called the ponytail rule, where women could only play in the Sao Paulo tournament if they had hair long enough to make a ponytail. So there's a lot of norms about femininity and beauty and heterosexuality that are constantly being put on these women players. And then you have marketing. Marketing. This here, I interviewed Sissy, who was captain of the Brazilian team. Yes, I see the faces of horror. Yeah, I agreed. She was featured in this. This is the most popular sports magazine in Brazil. She was featured in this. It's a special women's football, futebol feminino, but they're wearing volleyball spanks. Strange. So marketing around their hypersexualization of athletes, right? They're objectified in this way, and this throughout the 80s and 90s. So even though you have teams, she couldn't even show her mom. She said, you know, in the middle of this magazine, there was a whole spread on me. I was captain of the women's national team, and I couldn't even, like, I didn't even want to show her this. You know, she would have just been like, exactly, get out of it. And in the end, Sissy doesn't come back. She's the Golden Boot winner for the first Women's World Cup. And she doesn't even come back to play for Brazil again because she shaves her head and won't participate in the ponytail rule. So she's very interesting. She now, sometimes they bring her on as a commentarist. She's a coach in Southern California. But anyway, and then you have other shows like Botineras. Has anyone watched this? No, good, great. No, time in your life, you don't need to argue to get back. It's a terrible show. But the idea of WAGs, right? It comes imported from Europe. The idea that all the shows that we have are really going to be about men's football, and what we're going to spend most time on is their women partners. And that's still true today. You probably know who David Beckham's wife is, maybe? Who is she? Oh, okay. Yeah, cool. Who's Marta's wife?
Another player.
Yeah, somebody who once played. I don't really know. You know, so, and that's just because there's inordinate attention on WAGs, right? Wives and girlfriends. And instead of paying attention to women's players, they paid attention to men's players, partners, potential partners, and at the same time, though there was more and more increasing intimate partner violence in football and cases of sexual assault, all of the attention went towards salacious gossip about this, rather than what's the connection between this and our total neglect of the women's programs. And this sort of exists throughout, I would say, till the 2000s. And here we almost are up until today. So what happens today and what has happened over the last 7 years is a lot of solidarity among women's teams, clubs, fans, that is connected to the Ni Una Menos movement, the feminist movement in Latin America, that has really embraced this as a challenge. So in 2015, the Chilean women's team was totally off of the FIFA rankings, even though the men's team was always in the top 10. Same with Argentina. What that meant was they just hadn't even convoked the team. They got invitations and nobody answered them. The federation just not interested. And you probably remember the FIFA trials of 2015 here in the US. And one point I just want to make to you is the corruption in FIFA and the corruption in sports is intimately connected to gender inequity. Meaning if they're not accountable for, actually spending their money on youth development programs, they're also not accountable for spending that money on girls and women. And there's really a direct connection between those two things. Global football is run by a group of men that feel that they have no one that they need to be accountable to. And what that means is that they're never asked to open their ledger books, nor can they be trusted to see a disciplinary case through. So I'll get back to that. But women aren't really having it. And a lot of women fans in Latin America, particularly of clubs that are member-owned, have formed their own sections of gender and women's fans that have demanded that they beef up their women's sections, that they actually invest in them. And this is Colo Colo and a group of fans and members of Colo Colo that is also against private ownership. And they say, with force and courage, we're going to make a feminismo de clase, right? Or the idea of a kind of feminism that's broad-based, that appeals to working class women as well. And they're doing it. This is the football club. This is what they do. They've played a big part in the remaking of the Chilean Constitution, for better or worse. You saw strike actions. So the Argentine national women's team, and I've only got 2 more minutes to talk, I promise. And then let's open it up. The women's team went on strike in 2017. I translated their strike letter, which is, again, if you want to be a Latin American studies major, you get yourself in some really weird places. The women were like, can you please translate this for us? And I was like, but yes, I can. And they put it out there. They went on strike. There were some reforms made. They hadn't been paid. They get paid $8 a day to train for the national team. It's $8 a day. And they weren't even protesting the $8 a day. They hadn't received the payment in 18 months. So, they couldn't invest any money in tolls. I would drive with them to the center. It's the same center where Messi plays, where Riquelme played. And the tolls alone are more than $8 to make it to Ezeiza, which is the training camp. And so you had this kind of, listen to us, hear us. And this is the Puerto Rican team, the Puerto Rican national team, which had not been ever in a friendly until 2019. They played against Argentina. They called the Argentine women and they said, at the beginning of the match, we'd like to do a little protest. Is it okay with you? Can we just kick the ball and let that sit there for 30 seconds? And the Argentine team was like, of course. So a lot of the solidarity begets solidarity. The women's equal pay movement in the US is tremendously inspirational to these women. You hear it all the time. They're like, we just want, to do that. We want to do that thing. And I say, well, you don't have Title IX, so that's hard. But okay, yes, that would be great. And it's the same protest that started. The original one was like this. And it has a lot to do with the complaints about governance in Argentine football. So does anyone know what this is? That Messi did? You watched this and you just didn't know? You're like, he's just lost his mind? He's just like out there, just like super weird. No one knows what this is? Is it Topo Gigio? Do you know the cartoon? You know the cartoon? Yeah, it's an Italian mouse. It was like super popular in Argentina when Juan Riquelme, who's this guy who's Messi's hero, right, played for the Dutch coach, but it's his protest against Mauricio Macri in Argentina for not paying the players. And so it's a mouse that says, like, can you hear me? Why can't you hear me? So Mauricio Macri at the time, who went on to be president of Argentina, who is now president of FIFA Foundation, because these guys just never leave, was not paying them. And in the middle of the field, he would do this. And Van Gaal, who was very mean to Riquelme, who's Messi's favorite player, Messi was going to the Dutch bench, and I was there, and it was real weird. Because everybody was like, what's he doing? And I'm like, he's doing the Topo Gigio. Oh, sorry, I can't jump like this. He's doing it. You need to be an historian to know what this is. And so he's literally, because Juan Riquelme was very badly treated by the Dutch and told that Latin American players didn't play very disciplined, they cheated a lot, they were no good, you should just have Dutch players. And so it's an old axe to grind. And the women took and had their own Topo Gigio, and then they like sort of revised it to just the more obvious one-handed one. And then the Puerto Ricans have their own. Anyway, have their own. So there's a lot of solidarity, and a lot of these gestures within football are obvious. And then I'm going to end with the Colombian women's team. I did a lot of interviews for them for a very long piece I wrote before the World Cup in Global Sports Matters. If you're ever interested in their story, in 2017-19, they had sexual assault cases that were very serious of minors on the women's team, and they went to criminal court over it. And despite the fact that they won the case, the president of the federation and the coach stayed in place. And many of the women that spoke out and testified in that trial were left off of the national team, including people like Natalia Gaitan, who was the captain, and Ureli Rincon. So, like, they might have actually won the World Cup instead of being semifinalists had they had two of the best players who the federation left off. And it's been incredibly painful. Ureli Rincon continues to play in Italian Serie A, and she's been left off for like 6 years. Daniela Montoya, who you did see in the World Cup, missed the Olympics in 2016 for having retribution, for having spoken out. So I'd just like to say it'll be really interesting to watch what happens, and that their federation president, again, just to make the connection to you between sexism and corruption, because we often read it on separate pages of the newspaper, Ramon Jesurún, has been under criminal investigation for 7 years for illegal ticket sales, money laundering, all of these types of things, and has also been presiding over these cases, and we've seen absolutely no change. So really, the Spanish Federation, a lot of people ask me, what about Spain? Is Latin America? You know, it's just like a Hispano-sexism, and it's not. Any national team you would have asked at the World Cup, at the Women's World Cup this year, are you happy with your federation? Every single one would say no. Latin America is just what I study. And Spain, he just got caught. He just got caught, and people and the women's movement in Spain was not going to let that story go away. They were not going to accept that he just got carried away by his love of women's football, which he has neglected for 8 years. You know, like, and so we saw that. So I'm going to end there so that we can just, you know, I can hear more from you, but I really appreciate your listening and time and being here.
We'd like to thank Dr. Elsey for all of you for coming. We do have some time for questions. So if you want to ask a question, you can come over because we are recording this. Noah here has a microphone, and this is so it can go on the recording, so you can get 1 million hits on YouTube.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it seems very formal.
I'm wondering what you can say about the difference between the American women's national team, which is, undisputably the best in the world and historically, and just how the differences in America culturally versus Latin America and how that led to the emergence of women's soccer. I'm sure some of it has to do with the presence of football mainly, but basketball and baseball and hockey as kind of more masculine sports in the country. But what else can you say about the differences in the two places that would cause that? I'm Ashton Rowan, major undeclared.
Thank you. That's a great major. For a freshman, you will find it. So that's a great question. I think Title IX, since 1972, I mean, that's just fact. Them's the facts. I mean, statistically, you see the growth and the facilities. The facilities here at BYU, I just saw them, are so much better than the Argentine national women's team. I mean, they're really nice. And I know it's not always equal, and I know there's a lot of work to be done. No university has ever won a Title IX case where it's shown that they're inequitable, because they are. But they've huge growth, huge gains. We were just talking about Nebraska volleyball. I mean, that's a watershed, and it's been both in terms of women, like in my position, teachers, professors, people in academia, but in sports, it's been incredibly important in facilities and the opportunity to play after 18. So that's part of it. The other is that, yes, I mean, we have the three big sports, and then hockey and soccer as 4 or 5, right? So soccer has not been part of the national identity before the women's team. As we see it become more and more hinged to national political projects, women in Latin America, like Brazil, Uruguay, Peru, women get pushed further and harder out of it. Before, there's a little loosening, right? There's, like I said, women's leagues in the 30s. It's when Brazil becomes so invested in football as the national sport, when it puts tons of money in it, when that becomes the center, then it's more challenging for women to play. So I think you kind of answered it for me a little, and I would just add Title IX to that. It will be interesting because there's going to have to be some reckoning probably with pay to play here in the U.S. to keep that women's team as good as it should be and has been. Right now it is incredibly expensive. ID camps are incredibly expensive. They're more and more expensive. University is more expensive. So it's great that there's Title IX, but scholarships only go also so far, and they're very demanding in Division I. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, and I would say we probably need a serious look at the pay-to-play model in terms of feeding into U.S. women's national team, because it's very difficult as working class kids, boys and girls, to get to the point where you're seen. I mean, I'm sure Gio Reyna deserves to be Gio Reyna, but if Gio Reyna had no money, it would be very hard for him to have been found in this country. Very hard. There aren't that many programs. So maybe, I don't know, maybe we can do something with Salt Lake City. Maybe they wanna do a, kind of anti-pay to play. I don't know. So that's what I think is happening a little bit. Thank you.
My name is Hannah. I'm double majoring in applied mathematics and public health, and I was at the USA Vietnam game.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Was great. The 30-hour flight that I took to get there was not great.
Oh.
So BYU has won more women's soccer matches this season than any other team in the country. We're not ranked first, but we have that going for us. And our football team sucks. I'm not sure if I can say that on camera. But
they've had a disappointing season.
Yes, our football team is in a development period, but also our women's soccer team can't afford to put our names on our jerseys. What do you think that we can learn from the ways that Latin American women's football has revolutionized over the past 25 years for how to treat our women's teams better, especially here at BYU, where our women's teams perform better than our men's teams historically?
Yeah, I mean, your women's team is excellent, and I had the pleasure of meeting some of their coaching staff today, and like I said, seeing their facility, which I'm sorry about the Jersey situation, I don't know about that, but is quite good compared to other things. I would say, how do they revolutionize it? I mean, first, you show up, right? You get a really vociferous administrations, in my experience, and I don't know the institutional history of BYU, care about what students also are signaling, right? So as students signal, you know what I mean? The alumni signaling, making community events and partnering up with curricular and extracurricular activities. I am the advisor for the women's rugby team at Hofstra. I don't know anything about rugby, but they couldn't get any other faculty advisor. And so I was like, great, let's do a class, and then we're gonna go and we're gonna learn about it, we're gonna bring speakers, and a lot of it is student generated, They came to me, I wouldn't really have known. I'm not putting the onus on the students to make the athletic program, but certainly I think, a vocal and enthusiastic fan base goes a long way. And making relationships with the players that often don't really have time to be their own spokespeople. So boosterism's gone a long way in Latin American soccer culture. The other thing, and this is different because it's a school environment, is they sue them. They sue them. I mean, I'm not suggesting you should do that on this recording or anywhere. But when they got fired, they get a small honorarium from an academy in Argentina, and she felt she was unfairly fired. This is Macarena Sanchez. Her sister was a lawyer. She sued the club for unfair dismissal. She won. It ended up in 8 contracts for 8 teams in the Argentine league that had never existed before. So sometimes litigation. I mean, you just look. Can you work from within? Can you work from without? Can you be outside agitating? Can you be inside reforming? Both seem to work depending on the situation. So I'm sorry I don't know enough probably about BYU, but I would say that's probably not a very unique situation. And I think as student culture signals what it wants, things tend to change. Was that diplomatic enough? I hope so. Okay.
Hey, so would you say that there is more gender equality in Spain and Portugal in comparison to Latin America when it comes to women playing football, as known outside the United States? And also, does France and Italy consider to be a part of the Latin culture when it comes to playing football? And also, it's just like, because they're like Roman people, so kind of like different, but it's the same.
Yeah.
It's like, many cultural aspects. And the Falkland Islands belongs to us, the British Commonwealth of Nations.
The Malvinas?
Oh.
Oh, those, yeah. Well, I guess Puerto Rico belongs to us. I don't know. I mean, wow, that was coming in hot. Okay, so question number 1 was which? France, yeah. Okay, so yes. UEFA has put a lot of pressure on European countries to improve women's football, and I think that's made a big difference. The CONCACAF, the one that is in between a federation and FIFA, I know this is really boring governance, but the devil's in the details. CONCACAF is a mess. Our confederation's a mess. You don't know who's president. There's a verb that is used called "you've been CONCACAF'd" or "I CONCACAF someone," which means to just be in utter disarray, like to have done something that makes no sense. You've been CONCACAF'd or whatever. I'm CONCACAFing you. So it's UEFA, which is the European Confederation, has pressured to good effect, I think, Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, and has subsidized its professional leagues, and you have seen that they now no longer need that subsidy because they have now gotten access to the stadiums and the marketing, and you see more and more of the English league and all the leagues doing really well in England. And so I think that investment pays off, like with anything, and that certainly works. Do I consider France and Italy Latin America? No. I don't consider Spain Latin America either. I consider those Europe. And Latin America is trickier because, of course, a third of the U.S. Was Mexico, and now it's not. And so there's roots there and histories there. But I guess I think of anything south of the Rio Grande and down. But there's never a perfect term or a perfect word. But I don't see a lot of similarities in terms of football styles between, let's say, Argentina and Chile with France and Italy, but I see a lot of similarity in the styles between the men's and the women's team. The same with Brazil. You can pick out, they even have different positions in Brazil. So they don't even say the same, names. They have, we have this thing like a false nine, and, that doesn't really, exist in Argentina. There's, different terms for that. So I see those as a little distinct football cultures, but global women's football is connected. It's connected through governance, and what happened in Spain was really important for everybody. Yeah. Is there more time? Have I eaten up all of our time? Okay.
Any more questions? All right, well, let's all join together and give
Thank
another
you.
hand.